Hey everyone, Richard here with my co-author pdmac. We're going to be doing our author reading of our book Throne of Deceit. It's a book that we co-wrote together, and we wrote alternate POVs of characters. So I'll be reading the chapters for the character that I wrote, and he will be reading the chapters that he wrote. This is PDMac, and welcome PDMac to my YouTube channel. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you write.
Okay. Again, I'm pdmac. I write sci-fi. I write some romance, basically time travel romance. I write steampunk. Also write literary work and short stories. But pdmac, and had a great time doing this joint writing with Richard. It's great fun. I think you'll enjoy it. So
Yeah,
here we go.
Doug writes a lot of stuff, so we'll uh, we'll have fun reading this together, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. So I'll go ahead and start. Like I said, the book is Throne of Deceit, and my character's name is Gwen, and I'll go ahead and begin with chapter one. The Seven Stars Inn was busier than normal. That was good for business, but it also meant that Gwen had been rushing around most of the evening, filling tankards and delivering steaming food. It was warm, uncomfortably so, and Gwen was glad the night was almost over. The air was thick with pipe smoke and boisterous laughter, a rarity these days. Gwen spotted a man waving his arm, tankard upside down on the table. She heaved a weary sigh and hurried over to the table, forcing a smile. More ale? She asked. Yes, and keep it flowing, the man replied. Gwen could tell by the way he slurred his words that he'd probably already had too much, but she nodded and refilled his tankard. The inn would be closing soon, so not much more ale would be flowing anyway. Gwen's father had been in the kitchen since opening, fulfilling the endless stream of orders and cursing when he burned himself, which was quite often. A bard began playing a cheerful song, his fingers flying over the strings of his lute with a practiced ease. Gwen liked the melodies he played, but he was passing through, and tonight would be his last performance at the inn. She did another loop of the tables, making sure the patrons were taken care of, and then sat behind the bar and listened to the music. Gwen found the bard handsome. He was young and energetic, his face clean-shaven, and his brown hair trimmed short and neat. Her father would never allow her to marry someone with a profession that required constant travel, but she didn't see any problem with admiring the man's attractiveness. Besides that, it was common knowledge that Gwen would take over the Seven Stars once her father retired. As the bard finished his song, a commotion outside the inn caught Gwen's attention. She looked to the windows, but it was too dark to see anything other than vague shadows. The noise drew the attention of the inn's customers as well, and the people quickly congregated in front of the windows. Those who couldn't squeeze in among the others exited the doors to see things up close. Gwen heard angry shouting and groaned. Drunken men fist-fighting one another wasn't uncommon, especially when the place was busy. She removed her apron and hung it on the hooks on the wall, then walked to the door and cracked it open, peering out into the night. A single man was surrounded by a group of the king's soldiers. Their black leather armor made them blend in with the darkness, but Gwen knew the attire. The soldiers had become a common sight around the inn, and around Dawsbury in general. Rumors of war had been circulating for years, but now there were signs of it. Aside from the presence of the king's men, there were also whispers of dark magic and sightings of dragons. Gwen didn't know what to think about any of it. She lived a simple life working at the inn, and she wanted it to stay that way. The king could make war on his surrounding kingdoms if he wanted to, so long as Gwen's way of life wasn't impacted. Her attention was jerked back to the present when one of the soldiers kicked the man in the back of the legs, knocking him to the ground. The man, being harassed, scowled and tried to get up. Stay down, dog, one of the soldiers said. Yeah, chimed in another, if you know what's good for you. Someone bumped into Gwen from behind, and she looked over her shoulder to see Tobias, the baker's son. What's going on out there? He asked. Some of the soldiers have taken an interest in Gar, Gwen replied. Gar's angry, but I think he'll keep his temper under control. I can't stand those soldiers, Tobias muttered. They think they can come to our town and do whatever they want just because they wear the king's emblem. As long as we stay out of their way, we don't have anything to worry about, Gwen said. They're just following orders. Tobias snorted but didn't say anything. Gar was glaring daggers at the soldiers, but he stayed where he was. Good dog, one of the soldiers goaded. Now lick the dirt off my boots. Screw off, Gare spat. The soldier who'd spoke drew his sword and leveled the tip at Gar's throat. What was that, dog? Did I tell you to speak? Silence fell over everyone in the inn. Gwen watched intently, her heart hammering in her chest with anxiety. They can't kill someone for no reason, she whispered. That's what you'd think, anyway, Tobias said. When left unchecked, that tyrant's hired hands will do anything, including murdering innocent people. Watch your words, boy, one of the patrons said. You'll bring the king's wrath down on all of us. Gwen watched with bated breath, silently praying that Gar wouldn't be hurt. She wasn't friends with him, but she knew who he was, and they'd never had any issues. Even if they had, Gwen would never wish harm on anyone. Get to licking, the soldier demanded, lifting his boot near Gar's face. For a moment, Gwen thought he was going to lick the soldier's boot. Instead, Gar grabbed onto the soldier's leg and pulled, forcing the soldier to fall onto his back. Yeah, Tobias shouted. Give him what for? Gwen had a feeling something terrible was about to happen. The soldier scrambled back onto his feet and kicked Gar in the face. Gar crumbled backward awkwardly, his legs tucked under his body. Gods, Gwen said, flinching and looking at Tobias. Someone has to do something, Tobias said. They're going to kill him. Don't say that, Gwen replied. Tobias stared at her, jaw clenched. No more, he said. Before Gwen could figure out what he meant, Tobias drew a dagger and pushed past her. He sprinted toward the soldier that had kicked Gar and leaped onto his back, driving the small blade into the soldier's chest. The world froze. Gwen's eyes widened in horror and surprise. She screamed, and the world began moving again, but now it was a blur. The other soldier grabbed Tobias and forced him to the ground, wrenching his dagger away. The soldier he'd attempted to stab was uninjured. Some dogs don't understand loyalty, he said, then lifted his sword up threateningly. With a sudden grunt, he staggered forward as Gar pushed him from behind. Another soldier drew his sword and thrust it into Gar's back. Gwen stepped back from the door, shaken. Gar screamed and fell to the ground, writhing in the dirt. There was confusion among the rest of the soldiers as they glanced at each other with uncertainty. Tobias broke free of the men holding him and sprinted to the left, running down the alley beside the inn. The apparent leader threw his arms up. Don't just stand there, get him! The others chased after Tobias, and Gwen quietly shut the door and returned to the bar. The patrons slowly went back to their tables, but the mood had changed. The bard had stopped playing his music, and the conversations became muted. Gwen wrung her hands together nervously, not knowing what she could do to help Gar. Should she help him? What if he had done something to warrant the interest of the soldiers, and she wasn't privy to that knowledge? She started to head around the bar when the kitchen door flung open and Tobias ran in, followed by Boris, Gwen's father. What's going on? Boris demanded. I need somewhere to hide, Tobias replied. He looked around the inn, frantic. Gwen thought he looked like a frightened deer, ready to flee at any moment. Boris looked around the room, noting the patrons, then grabbed onto the edge of the bar. Help me, will you? Tobias grabbed the other end, and together they heaved the stout wooden structure forward. Gwen was surprised to see a trap door in the floor. Boris opened the small door and motioned to the darkness within. Go, he said. Hurry. Tobias didn't question the order and hurried down into the hidden space. Boris closed the door and tried to move the bar back into place, but it was too heavy. He looked at Gwen, then changed his mind and turned to the customers. Someone give me a hand. A few people leaped to their feet and to help, and within a few minutes, the bar was back in place. Father, Gwen said softly, following him into the kitchen, you never told me about that door. Forget that you ever saw it, Boris replied, washing his hands off in a bucket of clean water. He went back to preparing meals as if nothing had happened. Gwen watched her father work, wondering why his demeanor had changed so suddenly. There was something he wasn't telling her, that much was obvious. There was shouting in the common room, and Gwen rushed out of the kitchen. The soldiers had entered the inn and were harassing the customers. Gentlemen, Gwen greeted loudly, offering the largest smile she could muster. Drinks? We're looking for a criminal, one of them said. Gwen turned her attention to him and recognized him as the leader of the group from outside. I don't think I've seen anyone shady in here, but I'll help if I can, Gwen said cheerily. She was surprised her voice hadn't cracked. This person is an enemy of the king. He's dangerous, and we need to remove him from the streets. He's about my height and build, with black hair. Gwen put a puzzled look on her face and slowly shook her head. I can't say I've seen anyone like that in here. Would you like a drink while your men ask my customers? I'd love one, but I must refuse. I'm on duty. Right. Can't have you out there staggering around on the job, Gwen laughed. The soldier didn't share her mirth. The kitchen door opened as Boris came out, carrying a tray full of food. The soldier jumped, obviously startled, then calmed when he saw there was no threat. Evening, Boris greeted as he passed them, delivering the food to a table by the windows. If you see anyone matching the description, please report it to the local constabulary. They'll get word to us. I will, Gwen replied. The soldier turned his back to Gwen, and she noticed the uneasiness of the customers. Most were minding their own business, but a few people were staring death at the soldiers. Boris returned to the bar, and the lead soldier stopped him. Are you the owner? I am, Boris replied, offering a grin. It's a humble place, but it's served me well. It's a dump, the soldier grunted. I've also heard that it's a den of protection for the king's enemies. Boris looked pained. I have no, I have, I hope no one questions my devotion to the king, he said. I've been a staunch supporter all my years. The soldiers stared at Boris intently and then nodded, seeming satisfied. Anything? The soldier asked his men. Nothing, someone answered. Let's go then. The lead soldier looked from Boris to Gwen, then headed for the door. His men followed after him and they exited the inn. Gwen sighed in relief and leaned over the bar. That was close, she whispered. There was a pounding noise at the door, and Gwen realized that the soldiers were securing it so that no one could leave. Father, what's happening? Why did he say they're hiding enemies here? Boris, Boris suddenly looked older to her. Deep lines spread across his face, and there were bags under his eyes. There are things I haven't told you because I wanted to keep you safe, Boris replied. The customers of the inn began to panic and started kicking at the door. A few others picked up chairs and broke some of the windows, but they were greeted with flaming torches that were thrown into the inn. People scattered out of the way, knocking over tables and spilling drinks. Alcohol hit the torches and flames spread across the floor. We've got to get out of here, Gwen shouted. Boris grabbed her hand and led her through the kitchen to the back door, but when he pushed on it, it didn't budge. They blocked us in, Boris said grimly.
Chapter 2. This is Connell. Shackled to the thick iron rings hammered into the granite walls, in a dank prison was not the outcome Connell had in mind when he agreed to lead the latest rage on the market city. Once again, he berated himself for ignoring his gut feeling. It'll be easy, Oscon had said. A walk in the park. Get in, get out, and by the time you're back here, they won't know what happened. Why me? Connell frowned at the bandit chief, a hulking lummox of a man, beetle-browed with a sneer for a smile. 'Cause nobody expect you. You got that baby-faced look to your, like you're a choir boy. Connell's first instinct was to ask him the real reason for this sudden elevation to lead a raid. Until then, he had been little more than a gopher or lookout. It wasn't until he overheard Oscon talking about moving on, because they had pretty much skimmed all they could from the area towns and cities, and the constabulary and soldier patrols were becoming too frequent. That caused Connell to wonder, why do another raid? When he heard Oscon talk about thinning his herd, he knew something wasn't right. But vanity overruled his misgivings, and when Oscon poked his thick finger at him and said, "You're going to lead this one," Connell had squashed his reservations and stepped forward. His uneasiness was somewhat allayed when Oscon selected a few of the best men and women to go along. The setup played out to perfection. Once in the town, Connell had been recognized and immediately surrounded by 4 guards and 4 swords pointed much too closely at various parts of his body. When Connell frantically looked around for help, there was none. The 6 men and women who had so assiduously listened to his plan and followed him into town had melted away like morning dew. Had Connell paid more attention to his followers, he might have noticed them disappearing one by one, that by the time he was in the market square by the tax boxes, he was quite alone. The ultimate insult was when he swore the voice calling out, "I know him, he's a bandit," belonged to his second in command, Justin. And now, here he sat amidst the overlapping stench of unwashed bodies and the layered decay of the dead, wondering why Oscon had decided he was no longer useful, and vowing that he would hunt him down if it was the last thing he ever did, which, by the look of things, might be a tad difficult. His broodings were interrupted when he heard the far cell door grind open and a nobly dressed man, flanked by several guards, ease his way through the cell. Holding a handkerchief at his nose and mouth, Connell watched as the man occasionally stopped and pointed, whereupon 2 guards would grab the prisoner, unshackle him or her before handcuffing them and leading them away. When the man stopped in front of him, Connell flashed a loopy smile and received a pointed finger in return, whereupon he was yanked up, unshackled, then handcuffed, and led through the squalid mass of bodies, out through the door and recesses of the prison keep, to finally emerge into the morning outside and fresh air. Connell inhaled a deep, satisfying breath, then glanced to his left and right at the other prisoners lined up on both sides of him. There were 10 of them, 6 women and 4 men, all young and healthy, all handcuffed. The sergeant of the guard stood imperiously before them. He was a toad of a man, all body and skinny legs, wrapped in an ill-fitting uniform of the town's constabulary, crimson jacket with gold buttons, straight tan cotton trousers tucked into calf-high boots, and a leather helmet capped with a bristle that looked like someone had lost a shoe brush. Behind him, the nobleman stood, aloof, bordering on ennui, the handkerchief still at his mouth. He wore a long-sleeved white silk shirt, covered by a white cream-colored vest of the finest calfskin. His ebony trousers were handcrafted from rabbit skin, and his boots a work of art in the reptile skin. His Shuda hat and his full-bodied blonde hair fell about his shoulders, framing a handsome face with a square jaw and dark brown eyes. Connell guessed him to be closing in on 40. In accordance with Kingdom Statute 43-12, the sergeant bellowed, reading from an unfurled parchment, and with the honest, wholehearted concurrence of the burgomaster of Hamlin, you have been redeemed by Lord Farrell. Your sentences have been commuted to a life of servitude until such time that you die or are provided your freedom according to the wishes of Lord Farrell, Prince of the realm of Vandir. You are henceforth to be branded so that all may know the depths from which you have fallen. Should you choose to escape, know that you are subject to the laws of exile and retribution. Anyone finding an escaped slave may kill him or her. Farrell. Connell knew the name. The man ruled this part of the kingdom with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. He could be as cruel as he was generous. Connell felt a flash of relief, knowing if he would stay alive if he played his cards right. Those poor fettered souls left behind in the prison were as good as dead. Rolling up the parchment, the sergeant nodded to the guards, who force-marched the newly anointed slaves to the center of the town so that the entire populace could witness their debasement. Men, women, and curious children stood in the thick circle around the branding pit, the heat from the fire keeping them back or providing enough space for the guards to hold the victim down for the branding master, who instructed the poor soul to stay as still as possible. Moving while being branded caused a bad brand, requiring a second one. The normal location of a slave brand, concentric circles the size of a large coin, was on the cheek. Despite the rising fear of having his face forever marred, Connell noticed there were 4 irons in the fire. He knew the reason. Some slaves had a different brand placed on the outside of the right shoulder, a death's head, a skull with horns. These slaves were bound to protect the master with their lives. 2 other branding irons consisted of a viper and a rose. The viper brand was placed on the upper left arm. Vipers were the master's enforcers, assassins in muscle. They lived well. It was considered an honor to be a viper, for vipers could marry, and the children of a marriage were considered freeborn. The rose brand was placed on the right thigh. A rose slave was a pleasure slave. Connell prayed to whatever god or gods were out there that he would not be a rose slave, for he knew what happened to rose slaves. Sure, there were the few who had pleased their masters and allowed to live a life of privilege in the harem, but the majority of rose slaves, those whose beauty had faded, were sent to the farms to spend the rest of their lives in back-breaking labor. The 4th iron? Connell frowned in puzzlement for only a moment until his attention was diverted by Lord Farrell, who casually strolled down the line to stand in front of the first person, an attractive blonde woman about Connell's age. Staring at the woman for only a moment, Farrell dipped a finger at her. Rose. As the woman was dragged off to be branded, Farrell sidestepped to the next slave, a tall, strong teenager. Death's head. Connell was 7th in line, and his prayers increased in urgency and pleading as Farrell continued down the line, announcing, Rose, Death's head, Rose, Rose. Farrell stopped to appraise Connell as though he were judging a good horse. Folding his arms, he scrutinized the young man, impressed that the slave didn't avert his eyes or appear to grovel. Instead, the young man stood firm, appearing to be unafraid. Either you're a sheep who has no clue of what's going to happen, or you resign yourself to fate. Which is it? Fate, my lord. You answer with a strong voice, Farrell said with a slow nod, noting the young man didn't call him master as was required. Men like you tend to be wild, like a stallion that needs to be broken. They're too high-spirited. Are you high-spirited? Connell smiled at him. It all depends upon the rider, my lord. The skilled rider knows his mount, knows how to direct, how to coax with just the right words. A gifted rider and mount are a team to be envied. A smile flitted across Farrell's lips. You talk as one educated. Are you educated? Yes, my lord. Where was the failure, then, that you end up like this? Farrell looked down his nose at him. Connell shrugged. Bad crowd, bad choices. Not everyone who calls you friend is one. Well spoken, Farrell acknowledged. You're too pretty to have your cheek branded, and you're not big or strong enough to be a death's head. Connell's hopes took a nosedive, especially with the too pretty comment. What was it with these people and his looks? There were plenty of men who were better looking. Why couldn't people see that he was smart, that he had a brain? Steeling himself against the inevitable and already dreaming of a way to escape, he was startled when Farrell gently pushed a finger into his chest. Viper. Without thinking, Connell did a fist-pump exclaimed, yes, causing Farrell to smirk and flash a bemused glance at his curious fellow. He started to sidestep to the next one in line when he stopped and turned back to Connell. What is your name? Connell, my lord. Farrell nodded and continued the next three, all designated arose. With the choices decided, Lord Farrell stepped away to watch the branding, noting the demeanor of each slave. Amidst all the shifting and squirming and fear, only Connell seemed unaffected. In fact, the man seemed more than ready to get branded. After the woman before Connell had the rose mark burned into her skin and went sniveling to the medicine tent, Connell marched up, sat down, and pulled off his shirt, revealing a wiry and strong body, which elicited some whistles and catcalls, causing him to scowl. Bracing himself for the pain, he clenched his jaw, determined not to show weakness. Hold, Lord Farrell commanded as the brand master withdrew the glowing, red-hot viper iron. Farrell pointed to another iron next to it. Use that one. Suddenly fearing Lord Farrell had changed his mind, Connell struggled to determine which iron held the rose brand. His anxiety elevated as his gaze narrowed on the brandmaster, carefully retrieving the branding iron, then approaching him. The head was small like a rose, yet the design was wrong, and he frowned, twisting his head to glance up to Lord Farrell. The cobra, Lord Farrell calmly answered. Do not disappoint me. He turned and walked away, the guard sergeant hustling up next to him, obsequiously nodding and agreeing with the Lord's softly spoken conversation. The cobra. Connell's fear morphed to confident elation as he watched the not-so-subtle change in the crowd. Some were immediately intimidated, others unsure, and still others scoffed that so inexperienced a man should be chosen as a cobra. Yet they knew the reputation. The cobra was a leader among assassins, the silent, unseen killers. Still, a sense of relief spread through the crowd, for they knew this man would be taken away from here, for he was known. Connell flinched, then strained to remain immobile as the hot iron burned his flesh, the smell of burnt skin and the pain of his arm causing tears to well up in his eyes. Yet he sat rooted like a statue, grimly enduring his suffering. Finally, the brandmaster pulled the iron away and surveyed his work. Looks good, a good image. He tipped his head in admiration. You sat very still. Go to the tent for them to bandage your arm. Connell was halfway to the tent when he heard the screech of the next victim, a woman given a rose brand. Inside the tent, 3 healers applied salve and bandages to the branded areas. All too soon, the 10 slaves were again in line. No handcuffs this time. The crowds had drifted away, and few remained to witness their departure. Lord Farrell sat astride a magnificent dappled stallion, at least 17 hands high. He waited as the slaves were loaded onto carts, leaning forward when Connell made ready to grab the wagon rail and climb aboard. You, young Connell. Connell lowered his leg and turned to face his new master. Yes, my lord. Do you ride? Yes, my lord. Farrell nodded and flicked 2 fingers at his travel steward, a tall, lean man with close-cropped hair and beard. A few moments later, a servant led a sorrel mount, almost as tall as Lord Farrell's steed, to stand next to the Lord and Master. Farrell narrowed his focus on Connell, you will ride with me. Yes, my lord. With practiced ease, Connell swung up into the saddle, took hold of the reins, and slipped his feet into the stirrups. We are ready, my lord, the steward announced. And let's get started. I want to be in Denhelm by dinner time. Yes, my lord. The steward bustled up to the first wagon and climbed aboard, ticking his head at the driver who flicked the reins, causing the wagon to lurch forward. Soon, 4 wagons containing 9 slaves and supplies, surrounded by a dozen men-at-arms, the Lord and Master, and the newest Cobra, plodded out of the city. Connell rode next to Farrell, who remained silent until they were out of earshot of the city walls. It's a 3-day ride to my castle, Farrell spoke. We have plenty of time to get acquainted. You will tell me everything there is to know about you, and I will tell you what I expect of you. Yes, my lord. You may wonder why I chose you to be a Cobra when you have so little experience. The thought did occur to me, my lord. I have an eye for talent, and I believe you have the gifts I require. Do not worry. You will be trained as required for a Cobra. You perform well for me, and I will consider giving you your freedom. Connell reverently tipped his head. It will be an honor to serve you, my lord. Yes, I know, he replied with an indifferent nod. They loped along in silence for a bit. Tell me, young Connell, what is the first thing you wish to do as a Cobra? Connell didn't have to think about the answer. Find a certain outlaw and make him rue the day he was born. Farrell chuckled. All in good time, my young friend. All in good time.
All right. So that's the first 2 chapters of our book, Throne of Deceit. And we'll do some more videos reading the next chapters. So if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you get the notification when we have a new video up. And let us know in the comments what you guys think. How do you like our reading, and any questions or anything like that. See you guys next time.